All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Or good morning to folks remote. Good evening to folks in more easterly time zones. This is the 1:30 p.m. Amsterdam time session about secure messaging. I will be your session chair. I'm Richard Barnes. Now, I believe the conference has had a few remote presentations, but I will be the first remote session chair of the conference. So I appreciate it. We might have a couple of bugs to work out as we go, so I appreciate your tolerance there. With all that said, though, I think let's go ahead and get straight into things. Our first speaker today on secure messaging is Britta Hale to talk to us about securing messaging authentication against active man-in-the-middle attacks. With that, Britta, please.
All right, thank you. The secure messaging has gathered quite a bit of attention in the last several years due to its ability to have, for one, support asynchronicity, as well as some post-compromise basically features such as forward secrecy and the ability to heal from a passive attacker. And this work will look at the active attacker case. This is joint work with my co-author, Benjamin Dowling. So Signal is fairly representative of a typical continuous key exchange protocol used in the messaging space and what we'll focus on here. But the observations we have applied to other messaging protocols as well. What you see here is the core of a Signal ratchet, essentially the asynchronous Diffie-Hellman ratchet between Alice and Bob, with ratchet keys shown in blue, and they are combined to make a pre-master secret, which is then KDF for a root key. And every time we derive a new root key, we see that.
But I think your slides are not transitioning. You may want to reshare your slides.
Oh, thank you for letting me know. I'll give that a try. Let me know if you can see the next slide, please.
No.
Okay. It is showing that I cannot resume share. It's blocked permissions.
There's something in the chat that says, so you need to do Control-I in the PDF.
Can the AV team at the end help? Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Can you see the different slides now?
That looks good to me.
All good. Okay. Go ahead. All right. So we're back to Alice and Bob, and we've got a distribution service in the middle supporting this asynchronous key exchange. So far, so good. These sessions are often lasting for months or even years. So it's a continuous long-lived session. And that raises some questions about authentication, because in a normal key exchange protocol, parties will authenticate at the very start of the protocol. So how do we do this in Signal, for example? Well, in Signal, we have a variant that uses the user as an out-of-band mechanism to support authentication, and it works in trust in the first use method otherwise. So you just trust the keys at the beginning, but at some point the users meet up and compare either numeric codes or scan QR codes that are based on public keys. So this is a very important point. They are based on public keys. They're then used to compute fingerprints and are concatenated. So the claim in the app is that this will verify the security of the user's encryption. But there are a few issues. First of all, these fingerprints, again, are based on public static information. So unlike with a normal mutual authentication protocol where the users are proving knowledge of some secret key, here they are proving knowledge of public static values. This is further complicated by the fact that we are showing them to the user through a display, and there's various attacks in the literature that actually target the display to and from the user. These types of attacks do not generally imply compromise of the secret keys on the device. So it's not a typical crypto compromise. Instead, they, either through malware or various techniques, are able to display something to the user or alternatively, manipulate the user input on the screen. Another consideration to this is the possibility of impersonation after compromise. So if a device was compromised in the cryptographic sense, a man in the middle could basically impersonate Alice to Bob or Bob to Alice fairly trivially. That's the active attack that's normally out of scope in signal analyses. However, if you're talking about Alice and Bob comparing QR codes out of band, for example, this will not be detected because, once again, those QR code computations are based on long-term static values and have nothing to do with what's happening here in a given epoch. So essentially, Alice and Bob can compare, everything looks great in person, all the while being man in the middle. So this is not exactly ideal. And the question is, can we do better? Now, I should note that there is a possible argument here where we say, actually, compromise is out of scope for signal authentication or any similar messaging authentication. So this simply doesn't apply. However, the natural observation and counter to that is that if we are not considering compromise, why are we doing a ratcheted key exchange at all? Because if we're not considering that a device could be compromised, then we could just assume that a long-term static symmetric key is fine. So if we would really like to get authentication on this that matches the signal context, this ratcheted key exchange context, somehow we need to tie it to the epochs. And we also need to basically model that human user in some way. Now, that's not necessarily intrinsic that you always have to use this user out band, but that's the current paradigm. So how can we capture that? How can we get some sort of security model that correctly reflects the types of attacks that we see on that sort of channel? So in this work, we actually look at that type of framework with the mediated epoch three-party authentication model. And we do this by splitting into two pieces. It is three-party, but it's not your typical three devices, because again, what the user does and their interaction is completely distinct from having simply a third device. On the device-to-device channel, we have all sorts of typical queries that one sees in continuous key agreement protocol analyses and models. And then on the user-to-device channel, we have similar but different types of queries, essentially that we have short-term access, and we also have long-term access to either what is displayed to the user or what the user is able to enter into the device. So possibly misinterpreting user inputs and so forth. We then further split this up into different cases and look at them separately and cross-compare when the protocol is secure and when not. So in one case, we say it is a typical cryptographic attack where the adversary has complete control on what happens from device to device, in other words, a compromised device model, but we restrict it on the user-to-device side. And in the flip side, for the compromised user, we say the adversary has unrestricted access on the user side, but we are going to restrict it on the device-to-device. So that compromised device is really that classic case of a man in the middle possibly attacking and us wanting to detect it, that they have complete control. And for the reasons already noted, a signal is insecure in both of these settings for our model. So how can we fix this? What can we do about it? And the beauty of this solution is that it is so incredibly simple. First of all, in order to get authentication at the epoch to be able to detect everything that could be a man in the middle, we maintain a hash over all the public ratchet values up until the point of comparison of the QR codes. We also include role separation, which will come in a minute when we basically compare whether or not you do numeric comparison or simply a QR code scan, where you can differentiate with the QR code scan so that you don't have reflection attacks from just reading a screen. And from these hashes, we combine them with an authentication key. Now, this authentication key is a new introduction to the protocol, and it's simply one more key derivation, and that's derived per epoch. We then compute the fingerprints, the new fingerprints, over these authentication keys and the hash ratchets. to basically have a new value that a user can compare. And by maintaining 2 of these, we're able to account for asynchronicity as well. Now, this does not mean that they need to be deriving fingerprints at every epoch. That's a very important point. You don't need to be doing that. Instead, the user, when the user wants to compare out of band, which may be a year from now, they will flip the screen in the normal signal setting. So that means they have to stop messaging, right? And they'll flip over to the I want to authenticate to generate, say, their QR code. And at that time, you can actually compute these fingerprints. So you don't have to compute them all the time. And you only need the last 2 authentication keys, which are separate from all other keys already derived. So what does this look like for signal? Well, in the prior signal setting, this would all be red X's. And now we can certainly achieve better because we're able to tie information in for the epoch values. That's the compromised device. So that active adversary, that man in the middle, is really that compromised device setting that you see in green here. So even if we simply make all assumptions are okay on the user device channel, we can now at least detect that man in the middle. And we can get even better with some under even the compromised user setting if we are allowed non-matching in the scan. And the details of that, of what the different comparison methods are, can be found in the paper. So on that, I will hand it off to the next speaker, who is actually continuing with this work to take a look at how to do this without necessarily relying on the user in the middle. And we'll take a joint Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Proto. So now we will switch over to Alexandre Poirier, who is, I believe, in person.
Yes, so thank you for the presentation. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for the presentation. I will be talking about continuous authentication in secure messaging, which, as Britta said, is kind of a follow-up of the work they have done, and which also tackles the issue of active man-in-the-middle attacks in secure messaging. And because we have mostly worked on the signal setting, I will be presenting continuous authentication in the signal, with signal. So, yes, so let's have a quick recap on signal security. So signal offers secrecy and authenticity, as stated in the previous presentation, as well as forward secrecy, in the presence of an adversary which can fully compromise the network, as well as leak the secrets of some users. So here, for instance, if the adversary leaks the secrets of Alice, then secrecy and authenticity are no longer ensured. But hopefully, there is this post-compromise security property which states that if the adversary remains passive, then after some messages exchanged, Alice and Bob will retrieve some security because they are generating some random numbers that they can combine in a Diffie-Hellman secret key that the adversary will not know. But if the adversary remains active, then the adversary can conserve its man-in-the-middle position, which can have some dramatic consequences as sessions are really long-lived in signal. And he will actually have 2 different sessions, one with Alice and the other with Bob. And there is no way on the in-band channels that Alice and Bob can detect such an adversary. And that is why they need to rely on some fingerprinting mechanism using an out-of-band channel like we saw in the previous presentation. And our work is to tackle this issue, and because almost no one is actually using those out-of-band checks, we want to make something in-band by leveraging the identity keys that are used in the session initiation and are no longer used afterwards. Those identity keys could be authenticated using an out-of-band channel, but afterwards, active adversaries would be detected on the in-band channel thanks to our mechanism. And so this is what we have contributed. We have first created a model that captures active, so post-compromise security against active man-in-the-middle adversaries if they have not compromised long-term keys. And we have created a generic extension that can be applied to any secure messaging scheme like Signal to get this security. And as a proof of concept, we have also implemented this on top of the Java Signal library, and but we will not cover that here. So our method, the core of our method is authentication steps. Those are detection procedures that happen regularly during the communication and which will leverage the identity keys of users. So in this example, there is an adversary between Alice and Bob, which has managed to inject a message. But at some point, Alice and Bob will have this detection procedure that will try to detect if there has been an active adversary in their communication. And to do that, they create a transcript, which is basically a series of ciphertexts that they may hash to save space. And Alice will sign this transcript using her identity key and send the signature to Bob. And when Bob receives the signature, he will also compute on his part the transcript, his own version of the transcript, and verify if his version of the transcript and if the signature Alice has provided is a correct signature for his version. And if there is some injection, like here, then he will detect that there has been some tampering because the signature will not verify. However, if the signature is correct for his transcript, then he can be convinced that only the holder of the identity key of Alice would be able to forge to create such a signature, and he can be convinced that they have seen the same ciphertext. So for Signal and other messaging schemes, the computation of such a transcript is actually more complex because Signal operates on an unreliable channel, and so they first need to agree on the transcript of messages to sign, because even without attacker, some messages may get lost, but it is basically only some additional messages where Alice will send to Bob every message she has received. Bob will do the same, and after that they can agree on the set of messages to authenticate and can perform as in the last slide. However, we are not sure that the attacker has not compromised long-term keys. And in this event, the attacker could, in the detection procedure, replace Alice's signature by a forged signature if he has compromised Alice's long-term key. And in that case, there is no way that Bob can detect in-band this active adversary. However, they can use afterwards an out-of-band channel in some kind of fingerprinting mechanism to exchange their transcripts. And in this instance, they will see that the transcripts are different because there has been some injection, yet they passed the detection procedure in band. And that is a proof for them that Alice's long-term key has been compromised. And therefore, we have those two cases where either the long-term key is not compromised, and thus our generic extension will ensure that tampering can be detected in band, and so it is some kind of post-compromise security against active adversaries. Or we have the key compromised, but then if Alice and Bob use an out-of-band channel, they can detect that such a key has been compromised, and they can change it only when necessary, where we have some kind of we force the adversary to use this key in order and to reveal its knowledge in order to avoid in-band detection. So this is a generic solution because we didn't use any property of how Signal is implemented. So we are pretty sure this can be applied to any kind of messaging protocol to get this post-compromise security property. As a proof of concept, we implemented it on top of the official Java library for Signal. And also, this is currently a work in progress. We are also investigating other alternative solutions which may be simpler for the specific case of Signal. So thank you for your attention. And yeah, we can go to a Q&A with Rita also.
Thank you, Alexandra. I can't see the mic line yet. I think the local team is going to turn the camera around so I can help manage the mic queue. But as that's going on, as people are queuing up, one question from my side, I'm kind of comparing this signal-like code comparison flow to other kind of what I think of as more traditional authentication regimes, where you have things like certificates, which you could imagine carrying forward to a messaging situation. So what I'm wondering is, if you imagine a messaging situation where you had something like certificates for users, would a bunch of this stuff still be necessary for asynchronicity or continuous security? Or would the kind of certificates and credentials handle most of the authentication needs?
Well, I can have a go at that since it has to do with the user side. So you don't need a lot of the stuff that would go into the actual, like the QR code comparison, for example. So that's the good news. You still need some sort of ratchet authentication. So like what Alexandra pointed out, is that you need something that you're pulling out per epoch. In addition to you're essentially relying on long-term secret keys in the certificate, so you're pulling something out per epoch. But if you're combining those in the right way, then you can bypass some of the user side overhead that you have to compute on.
Great, thanks. And I'm told there's someone in the in-person queue, so whoever's there in the room, you feel free to ask your question, please.
Okay, I have two questions. One is about the first talk and the other is about the second one. So I'll go with the first. Like when a device is compromised, isn't it possible for the attacker to like influence the ratchet keys that would be used to generating the fingerprint later on? And wouldn't that be like counterproductive? And for the second presentation, doesn't the add-on you present to Signal completely remove the property of deniability? That's it.
Okay, to answer the first question, absolutely. The adversary can inject its own ratchet secrets, and it can man the middle connections simply like as presented. What will be different is that when it can't control the user channels, when the users compare these codes out of band, they won't match. So the users can know that there was basically a man in the middle, some attack at some point in time.
Right.
And for the deniability question, we actually are using some designated verifier signature. So it actually conserves deniability because only the designated verifier can check if the signature is correct or not.
Oh, okay, thanks.
All right, thanks for that question. And thank you again to Proto and Alexandre for the presentations. With that, I think we need to move on to the next talk. Thank you. Next up, we have Matt Green talking about evaluating the risks of client-side scanning.
Okay, 1 second. I'm just getting my video working. Give me 2 seconds. Sorry, I have to stop sharing. Do that. Okay, hi everybody. I hate doing this remotely. Excellent. Okay, just let me know if that's working okay. I'm going to take silence as affirmation.
I see it on Zoom.
Okay, let's go with that. Okay, today, first of all, I'm very sorry I can't be there. I was really looking forward to this conference, but and in any case, I am talking today after those two very strong technical talks. I'm giving a slightly less technical talk about the risks of client-side scanning, and this is a talk with my co-authors who are here on the screen. Some of whom were planning on coming, but could also not make it. And I actually want to pitch a report that some of my co-authors wrote about this topic, and I'll talk about it at the end. Good. So this is a very important topic, I think, because obviously, we're all talking about the technical details of secure messaging. The question now we should be asking ourselves is, should we be allowed to deploy secure messaging. And that's a major debate. Obviously, people have talked about this already. I hate to summarize a very, very complicated policy debate in a single slide. But if I could summarize that very complicated policy debate, it's that end-to-end encrypted messaging and end-to-end encrypted systems have begun to proliferate. We have maybe 2 billion people worldwide who are able to use end-to-end encryption. And that number continues to increase, mostly because companies like Facebook are pushing very hard to increase the amount of end-to-end encryption in their platforms. This has created a lot of blowback, and the blowback is mainly from law enforcement agencies and governments around the world who are very concerned that these new platforms will cause problems for law enforcement, for the ability to actually trace suspects and to do other kinds of things that they believe are critical. Over the last, I would say up until 2019 or so, this debate was a relatively simple one. The question was, can we gain access to encrypted messaging in exceptional circumstances? This capability was called exceptional access, and it involved basically having some kind of targeted decryption capability for governments or for law enforcement with a subpoena. And the only really good way that we had to realize that was using key escrow. And there was there were a lot of concerns about the security and the reliability of key escrow systems. And where that debate wound up by about 2019 was mostly kind of a stalemate. Even people on the policy side of the debate, on the law enforcement side of the debate, felt that there were some concerns with the existing technology for key escrow, and that there were deployment concerns, and that for at least data in motion for messaging, there were probably some serious risks that couldn't quite be overcome with the systems that we had available. And just as evidence for that, if you don't believe me, there's some great reports, one by the National Academy of Sciences here in the US, another by the Carnegie Institution, that really summarizes this with a broad group of stakeholders kind of saying the same things that I'm saying today. And that's where we got to by about 2019. And when you're in a sticky situation, when you're stuck in a chess game, maybe the answer isn't to continue playing the chess game, maybe it's to flip the board. And so in about 2019, the strategy, at least coming out of high-level government officials in the US, the UK, and Australia, changed. And this was represented by an open letter that was signed by then Attorney General in the US, William Barr, as well as the Home Secretary for the UK and the corresponding person in Australia, who unfortunately their name I don't know. And this basically resulted in a kind of a substantial change in the request. And I don't think that technically people realized how substantial this change was. But rather than asking for occasional exceptional access to encrypted messaging, this letter essentially said, hey, we have all of these essentially mass surveillance systems, these systems that are constantly scanning messages for the presence of abusive content, such as child sexual abuse media and other types of content. These systems will stop working the minute there are encrypted, end-to-end encrypted systems handling those messages. And this was just a technically, maybe from a law enforcement perspective, this wasn't a big shift. Technically, it was a massive shift in essentially what this entire technical debate was about. And I just want to quote one section from the open letter that was published back in 2019. It had a very specific request, and the request was this. It was to embed the safety of the public in system designs, thereby enabling you to continue to act against illegal content effectively with no reduction to safety and facilitating the prosecution of offenders and safeguarding of victims. And so this actually, not only did it sort of change the technical shape of the debate, but it led to a new sort of set of research and discussions in the technical community where people began to ask, is it possible to build systems that can scan for abusive content while maintaining end-to-end encryption? And I think for this audience, probably much of this history is not necessary, but I want to just kind of go over the very, very basics just to bring us to a point where we're at least all on the same page. I want to show you briefly, hopefully you can see this, what CSAM is child sexual abuse media, what the CSAM detection infrastructure looks like today in unencrypted messaging and data sharing systems. Many of you are already familiar with this. Generally speaking, when I send a message through a system like Facebook Messenger, which is not currently by default encrypted, what happens is my client sends that image up to a server. That server then computes what's called a perceptual hash of that image. And that perceptual hash is not really a cryptographic hash function, it's a specialized hash function that is designed to be robust to changes in the actual image encoding. So you get a hash or a digest that roughly summarizes the semantic content of the image. And so there is, typically these are exact hashes, or they can be inexact hashes that allow comparison with some differences to get a similarity metric. And on the server, there's also a database, which is a proprietary database of known abusive material. And the image is then compared to this database, and if it matches, some kind of internal flag is raised. There is a second version of this approach, which is being pioneered by Google, which does not use perceptual hash functions. It actually uses neural network classifiers. And I just want to compare these two because they're both relevant since they're both being used in unencrypted systems. The hash-based approach is excellent at finding known content, even if it's been slightly modified, but it's limited to finding known CSAM content. These newer approaches, like the one being pioneered by Google, are trained on large corpus of known content, but they can then recognize potentially novel content. And this makes them more powerful, but also with a higher risk of false positives, potentially. So these are kind of the two systems that are in use today outside of encrypted systems. They both have limitations that make them unsuitable for the deployment of end-to-end encryption. One of them is that the server has to see, the obvious one, of course, is the server has to see the media. End-to-end encrypted systems block the server. Server can't access this data, and so we're locked out and can't do much. There is at least, some advantage, which is that the databases themselves and the matching algorithms are proprietary and they can be kept behind on the server, which makes it more difficult for criminals to evade these systems or find ways to spoof these systems. They also create another possibility, which is there's this possibility for abuse and surveillance by providers. However, we tend to discount that because the systems are not end-to-end encrypted in the first place. So adding a surveillance system on top of a non-end-to-end encrypted system tends to not rub people the wrong way, or at least it doesn't make this situation dramatically worse. Okay, good. So these are the systems that don't work with encryption. How do we do client-side scanning? How do we do scanning when we have encrypted systems? So there are a couple of answers to that. The obvious straw man answer is we do the scanning on the client side. And that means performing the hashing, the verification, the matching on the client side where the data is not encrypted. And then when we find a match, the client can simply report the existence of that match up to the provider. And this works well enough if you trust the client, but it has a major limitation, which of course is actually devastating in the setting of CSAM. The problem is that nobody wants to make that hash database available to clients. And they also, in some cases, don't even want the hashing algorithms to be available to clients. And so the result of this, and there are several reasons for this, one of which is that existing perceptual algorithms, hashing algorithms, may be slightly reversible, which means that you could expose victim content to outsiders who could potentially reverse this. You might obtain a very low resolution image from some of these hash values, but you could still obtain something. So there's a confidentiality risk for victims. It also allows for the possibility that people can detect whether they are going to be caught, and they can find ways to evade by not sending certain images. And they could even potentially create new CSAM material if we were talking about one of the systems that used a neural network. So this is generally believed to be unacceptable, exposing the hash database directly to the client themselves. The obvious answer, and this audience in particular should know, the obvious answer is let's use crypto. Ultimately, we can build some kind of two-party computation between the client and the provider, in which the provider submits the hash database, maybe even the algorithms. The client submits their image that's going to be sent, and the 2PC does some kind of matching procedure. And that matching procedure could be limited. It could be, across many messages. If I send 30 messages that match, only then will some kind of signal and possibly the decrypted content be delivered to the provider. And this is an area that was kind of entering active research up until, I would say, August of 2021, so last August. And I think, again, this audience should be familiar with what happened last August, which is that research became very real in a hurry. And that happened with the release of a proposed system that was to be deployed in all Apple iPhones, at least in the US, last August. It was supposed to be released with iOS 15. This received a lot of press, so I won't belabor it, but Apple developed a client-side, 2PC-based scanning system that used private set intersection and a new perceptual hash function they developed to perform client-side media scanning of photo libraries on Apple phones. And really, I can't say enough good things about the cryptographic elements of this protocol. I think it's, beautifully executed, but also, unfortunately, I think fairly dangerous. And I hope that I still have a little time. I'm going to just briefly talk about some of the obvious concerns and talk about sort of why I think Apple didn't address these. Although this is not really an Apple-focused presentation. And then hopefully we'll still have a little time for people who have questions at the end. There are a number of risks in these systems, and kind of figuring out how to address these risks was the biggest part of the research question that I think was being addressed in the year prior to last August. And the biggest one for me is the possibility of mission creep. These systems ultimately perform scanning of a live database that can be updated by a provider. That database contains information. The information is provided by organizations that are quasi-governmental, like NCMEC, which is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The actual raw imagery, for very, very good reasons, is kept confidential. And so ultimately what NCMEC releases is a series of perceptual hashes of that imagery. And they are then notified after some internal monitoring by companies when there is a customer who matches that database. So there is this possibility that, with or without the consent of providers like Apple or Facebook, these databases could be expanded either surreptitiously or overtly to include new kinds of content. And I think this debate became very heated on the internet last summer, but I want to point out one thing that, this is not some theoretical concern. In fact, if you go back to the 2019 Barr-Patel letter, you actually see that it doesn't just talk about adding the capability to scan for CSAM material. It lists other type of material as equally important. And the two types of material that are given as examples are terrorist content, which is something that providers in the UK at least already scan for pretty rigorously, as well as, and this one's a little weird, foreign adversaries' attempts to undermine democratic institutions. I'm not sure what a hash database looks like for election disinformation, but if one could be built, there's certainly motivation to do this. So this is not theory. There's clearly a demand to do this. And I just want to sort of, highlight Apple's response to this, which is, well, no, we won't do this. There's been a lot of debate about how credible it is that a single provider could basically block governments requesting this. I guess that's the major question is, now that we've removed the technical restrictions, can providers actually hold back on adding to that database? Okay, the next obvious concern is unauthorized surveillance. So this is a flavor of the previous, which is that malicious providers and government organizations can obviously sneak unauthorized content into the scanning system. And there is certainly motivation. This might be a hacked provider, or it might be a hacked organization adding this content. The challenge here is that privacy-preserving 2PC protocols make this extremely difficult to prevent. And just to kind of show you, if you look at how difficult this is, let's take Apple as an example. Apple, in their literature, says the system is designed to be auditable, and that this is in their frequently asked questions. But when you dig into the published documents of the protocols that were put out by Apple, and you look at their actual systems, you see that there is no evidence in any of the actual cryptographic protocols or proofs that these auditability systems were built in. And just to give you one very concrete example, there is a point in the Apple PSI protocol where you insert, when there is an empty space in the encrypted database, you insert a random element. That random element should be a random element, but of course the distribution of meaningful database elements is indistinguishable from random elements. And the protocol does not do a good job, at least as currently specified, at ensuring that this doesn't happen to real systems. So there are many challenges. It's possible this could be built into an auditable system, but as published today, that hasn't been done. And that's beyond the question of how do you actually verify the content that's being put into the system is valid. Don't want to go over here. So last obvious question is, how do you prevent malicious false positives? With many of these models and hash functions, it's possible to generate essentially collisions, harmless images that you can send to people as memes and you can put into people's photo libraries that will register as matching a known hash database. And so far, the current solution to this is mostly to try to keep the hash functions and the models secret. Unfortunately, this doesn't work. It took about 2 weeks for Apple's neural hash function to be reverse engineered last summer, and it took about 3 more days for people to develop viable, reasonable looking collisions between different images. This one on the top is from Greg Maxwell, and the others are actually natural collisions. The one on the top right and the one on the top left are natural collisions people found just looking through databases. The one I want to point out at the bottom is a call out to my students who have been doing the same kind of work for photo DNA and other perceptual hashes, and these turn out to be just as vulnerable to this kind of collision attack. Okay, nearing the end here. What I want to say is two things. The first is that none of this is over. Apple has delayed its plans to deploy these systems, and we'll find out Apple is a leader, so what they do will tend to influence the industry. But there are other people who are considering this as well. Many people have decided that because Apple delayed their plans, that the debate is over, even within Apple and so on. It's probably not. These systems exist and they will be built. And there's going to be a continual debate about whether deploying them makes sense. Even if Apple backs off its proposal, the idea is not going to go away. And the last thing that I want to say, and I want to say it to this audience of, many younger junior people whose careers are just starting out, which is that, this is a substantial and important debate. Even if we use privacy preserving technology, really backwards privacy preserving technology where the privacy is not applied to the users. End-to-end encrypted content detection is a surveillance system, and it's one of the most powerful, ubiquitous surveillance systems we've ever considered deploying, and at least in democratic nations. And I think we should think very, very carefully before we build that infrastructure. If we must build that infrastructure, then we have to figure out how, as researchers, we can make it auditable and fundamentally resistant to abuses from the start, rather than waiting until after it's been deployed and trying to bolt on these systems. Okay, the last thing I will say is that there's an excellent paper about this by some of my co-authors, not myself, but some of my co-authors. It's called Bugs in Our Pockets. It has a much more detailed argument about the risks than anything I could give here in this short presentation. So please go check it out and read it. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. We have a few minutes for questions. If people would like to come to the microphone or put them into chat or Zulip. While people are getting organized, Matt, to try and maybe pull a silver lining out of your black slides. I wonder, setting aside the law enforcement applications, are there things that have been learned through the development of these kind of PSI and NPC things that have been developed that might be applicable to more benign features of messaging systems?
Yeah, I think that the development of these PSI systems and even 2PC neural network evaluation has been incredibly valuable. And I think, the ability to do this kind of work and do it very efficiently is important. So, there are clearly applications where this is not going to be a violation of privacy, where people need to do this kind of scanning. So there's no problem with the technology. The concern that I have is that, sometimes we develop technology before we know whether we're ready to do it, what we're ready to do with it. It's kind of the Jurassic Park problem of cryptography, is that, we need to make sure that we know how to control the dinosaurs before we set them free on the island. But I do think the technology is wonderful, and I'm very enthusiastic about it.
We have one question at the microphone. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I remember reading at some point a report by, I believe, the Australian Federal Police about Facebook PDQ, reasoning about the fact that while for non-malicious, they call them, modifications, the performance at detecting true positives was very good, this degraded very quickly as soon as you put a minimum effort, like slightly rotating the picture or something like that. So I'm wondering, do you have a clear understanding of what's the adversarial model that law enforcement is thinking of? Because I understand that seasoned users sometimes can be very much looking into being adversarial to evade control, while honest users might instead not be worrying about that and get tracked as a consequence of enabling this kind of technology.
Yeah, I think that these systems, what we've learned about these systems is they are not particularly robust to adversarial behavior of any kind. Even mild attempts to evade the system are very easy to get away with. This is particularly true with the open source algorithms, but there's no such thing as a secret algorithm. We learned that because both neural hash and photo DNA leaked out this summer within weeks of this Apple announcement. So these public algorithms are not robust. They will never be robust. It's impossible to make them so. So we are targeting a really low hanging fruit of users who are just not trying to evade. That unfortunately is relatively easy to do right now, because it turns out that most users who are caught sending CSAM content, don't get prosecuted. 97% of them are outside of the US, at least here. So our agencies can't really do anything with most of the reports that we get. So there's not really much incentive to invade. If the systems work well, maybe the adversarial model would be stronger, but we're not there.
Thank you.
Right, and thank you again, Matt. Great talk.
Thank you.
So next, we turn our attention to some analysis on Telegram, 4 attacks and a proof for Telegram. And I believe we have Igor Stefanovs on the Zoom to present. Igor, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, great. Please go ahead.
Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see the slide?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So let me start then. So this talk is based on the Telegram paper that will appear in the Security and Privacy Conference in May of 2022. And so let's start by discussing the relevance of Telegram. It is one of the most used instant messaging applications in terms of monthly active users. It has roughly 550 million users. So according to the study published previous year in Usenix, Telegram was the predominant messaging application used in the Hong Kong protests in 2019-2020. And generally, Telegram was perceived by protesters to provide more security than its competitors. And so the important advantages of Telegram, according to the protesters in Hong Kong, are the support of public and private group chats up to 200,000 people, whereas in Signal you have group chats up to at most 1,000. WhatsApp supports 256. Second advantage of Telegram is that it supports pseudonymity, meaning you can use a pseudonym rather than reveal your phone number to the people in your group. This is not supported by Signal and WhatsApp. And there are a number of other features that are valuable to the protesters, such as anonymous calls, disappearing messages, timed or scheduled messages, ability to delete messages sent by other people. And so I guess the most valuable thing for us that was discovered in this paper is that the common use case for Telegram was that it was generally used in large groups, in large public groups up to 50,000 members, and in small private groups. So here important is that it's mostly used for group chats, and yeah, there are two different use cases for different sizes of chats. Okay, so the Telegram offers two types of chats, cloud chats and secret chats. In cloud chats, you can do group communication. You can do one-on-one communication. You get client-server encryption, and cloud chats are enabled by default. So by default, you do get client-server communication. In contrast, in secret chats, you can only do one-on-one communication. It is end-to-end encrypted, but it is not enabled by default when you open the one-on-one chat. So in order to provide this encryption, Telegram has invented its own empty Proto protocol. It is Telegram's equivalent of the TLS protocol. So in cloud chats, Telegram uses the empty Proto protocol to encrypt and authenticate messages from the client to the server, and then from the server to the other clients. Whereas in secret chats, in addition to that, the messages are also end-to-end encrypted. This in particular means that each secret chat message, each end-to-end encrypted message is encrypted first to the key. And then on top of that, it's again double encrypted to the key of the server. Double encryption going on here. So the empty protocol, Telegram was launched with version 1 of the protocol in 2013. In 2016, a CCA attack against MT Proto version 1. In 2017, Telegram updated the protocol to release version 2. In 2017 and 18, there were two works that reported some works with the protocol. In 2020, a paper proved MT secure in the symbolic model, assuming ideal building blocks and abstracting away all implementation and primitive details. And so the focus in the literature this far has actually been on the secret shots, whereas as discussed in relation to the protests in Hong Kong, we do want to mostly study the cloud shots, meaning we will study the client server encryption. And at this point, I guess a reasonable question would be, why just not use TS instead of MT Proto? And there is no, well, basically the Telegram development team insists that they do prefer MT Proto and that it's good enough for their purpose. So there's no sort of deeper reason than that. Okay, so let me explain how MT Proto is designed. Here I will start at a very high abstraction level and I will gradually add some more details. However, it's so complicated that I will omit and simplify some of the details that are not relevant to this talk. Okay, so let's start by sort of the overreaching idea is that MT Proto is designed as a variant of the encrypted MAC composition. Here you have some payload that gets hashed with the MAC algorithm that is keyed with some long-term MAC key, MK, and you get the tag as the output, which is called key in MT Proto. And at the same time, this payload is also encrypted with symmetric encryption scheme with some key in IV. We'll get to this in a second to produce a ciphertext. Okay, so now let's flesh out more details. So this key in IV for symmetric encryption scheme is actually derived using a key derivation algorithm that takes the tag as input and uses some long-term key derivation key as well. So, okay, so this basically represents the encryption algorithm in the MT Proto. You can now imagine basically that the decryption algorithm would go everything in reverse. It would take the ciphertext and the message key. It would derive the symmetric key using the KDF from the message key, decrypt the ciphertext, and then it would have to do the verification of the hash in order to confirm that the ciphertext was not tampered with. Okay, so now I guess the most important detail here is obviously that in generic encrypted MAC constructions, the MAC would reveal the equality of the plain text or of the payloads. Here, this is not a problem because payload is payload consists of a bunch of metadata, and it will guarantee that not the plain text will be the same. So in particular, the details of the payloads will be important for our attacks. So let us look at each payload here. So the payload starts with two 128-bit blocks of metadata, followed by an arbitrary number of blocks containing the actual body of the message, and then some random padding from 12 to 1,000 bytes. So in the first block, you get server, salt, and session ID. Those are random 64-bit values. The server salt is changed by the server roughly once per hour. The session ID value remains the same until the long-term keys are changed. Block, you get the message sequence number and message length. The first, the sequence number assigns a distinct counter to each message. The message length is basically the length of the message in bytes. Yeah, so now let's continue with the design of MT Proto. This metric encryption scheme that is used here is actually an infinite garbling extension mode based on AES-256. The infinite garbling extension is not a commonly used mode of operation, and there is some prior work showing that IGE does not satisfy certain security notions. However, observe that when compared to the CBC mode, the IG mode, in addition, XORs each plain text block the next ciphertext block. This makes it rather straightforward that if CBC provides ciphertext indexability from uniformly random strings and keys, then so does IgE. And we will show, well, we show in our work that this property is sufficient. So IgE is fine for the purpose of Proto. Now let's look at the construction of the message authentication code algorithm and the KDF algorithm. Most of them are actually based on SHA-256. The MAC algorithm concatenates the long-term message key with the payload, runs it through SHA-256, and then truncates the output, the middle 128 bits of the output. That's the tag. The KDF algorithm splits the long-term KDF key in halves. It runs two evaluations of SHA-256 function. One of them concatenates message key with the first half of the KDF long-term key. The second concatenates the second half of the KDF key with the message key. And it outputs the concatenation of these two keys that it derived. Finally, it also turns out that different but related MAC and KDF keys are used depending on whether a message in MT Proto is sent from a client to a server or in the opposite direction. Here you can see a picture that shows how to derive the KDF and MAC keys from a raw GXY value that is obtained as a result of Diffie-Hellman key exchange. And you can see that depending on which direction you send the message from client or from server, you would use related keys in order to run KDF and MAC. Okay, so now to finish the discussion about the construction, in our work we managed to prove that the variant of MT Proto satisfies some form of authenticated encryption, but this comes with many caveats. Our formal definition of MT Proto deviates from the actual real-world construction or simplifies it in several ways. For example, we have to assume that the output of the Diffie-Hellman key exchange GXY is a uniform bit string. It's actually not. Furthermore, our proof relies on novel assumptions about the block cipher, SHA-CAL2, that is used in the Davis-Meyer construction of the SHA-256 compression function. We need it to be PRF secure under different forms of related keys and key leakage. It seems that any proof here would help to deal with such related key assumptions about SHA-CAL2. To conclude the discussion about provable security, further analysis is needed to reach any conclusions about security of MT Proto as the actual real-world. Okay, so now now that we have disposed of the proof, let us simplify our picture for MT Proto design again. So now we'll discuss attacks. For the sake of attacks, we'll only need this much details. In particular, we will not care how MAC and KDF algorithms are constructed. We only care about the structure of the payload and about IG mode of operation. So we found 4 weaknesses in MT Proto, and we reported them to Telegram on April 16, 2021. Telegram acknowledged this soon after, and they acknowledged the behaviors on June 8, 2021. We agreed disclosure on July 16, 2021. Telegram told us that they do not do security or bug fix releases except for immediate post-release cache fixes. They did not wish to issue security advisories at the time of patching, and they did not commit to release to any release dates for specific fixes. And so eventually they rolled the fixes as part of regular updates in version 7.8.1 for Android, 7.8.3 for iOS, and 2.8.8 for desktop. Now, let us speak about our attacks. So we have 4 attacks. We have an attack showing that MT Proto is not IND CPA secure. This is a purely theoretical attack. We have a message reordering attack. It is trivial and easy to exploit, obviously not very impactful. We have timing side channel attacks against client and server. the one against the client does plain text recovery, against the server does man in the middle and key exchange. Unfortunately, they are not, or rather fortunately, they're not feasible in practice. And yeah, Telegram awarded the bug bounty for side channel attacks and for the overall analysis that we did. Okay, so I'm going to scroll through these first two attacks quickly because they are trivial. For the identity attack, I'm not going to the details here, but basically what happens is that if a payload is encrypted and sent from a client to the server, but the client does not receive an encrypted acknowledgement that the encrypted payload was received, then the client would re-encrypt the payloads again using all the same metadata, the same message, but a different padding, different random padding. So what it leads to is that if there is a collision in padding across multiple encryptions of the payloads with no acknowledgement in between, then the birthday would give you a collision message key. Collision message key would result in some blocks of the ciphertext being equal. So you would be able to tell whether the ciphertext coming from the server to the client do encrypt an acknowledgement of the receipt of your payloads or not as an IDCP attacker. The second attack does message reordering attack. So for the message reordering, an adversary sitting on a wire from a client to a server can simply reorder the encrypted messages, and the server will use, the server actually timestamps the ciphertext it receives in the order that it receives them rather than in the order they are sent from the client. And so then eventually even the client who was sending these messages initially would update its transcript to use the same order of messages. Okay, so let's get to the interesting attacks. First, we have a dynamic side channel attack against clients. Here, consider what happens when you run the empty proto decryption algorithm. So you take a ciphertext, you run it through IG mode decryption, and as a result, you get the first two blocks of the payload: server salt session ID, the message sequence number, message length, and some message. So what happens in what happened before it's fixed, obviously, the three official clients was that the clients run some sanity checks on the decrypted payload prior to verifying the hash. So in particular, here we have three examples that immediately after decrypting the ciphertext and acquiring the payload, the message length value is compared to different values in different clients, either to a value supplied by attacker or to a value supplied or the constant 224 or some more complicated check. In either way, if this sanity check of the message length failed, then in the first case, in the second case, in the desktop client, the verification of the hash was completely omitted. This obviously gives a great opportunity to run time exceptional.
Igor, we're running a little short on time, so if you could try and wrap up, please.
Yeah. Okay, so what we do here is we use the we use the ID from the SSH paper in 2009 against CBC. Assume that we know message M1 and message MI-1. We want to learn the contents of MI. What we do is we take the value as the input of the block cipher encryption for the message we want to learn and move it to the second block. So we set C2 equals CI XOR I-1 XOR M1. And we observe that at the output of the second decryption, we get MI XOR CI-1, the same on the blue dots here and here. So in the result, we get 2 equals this blue thing XOR C1. Now, the side channel attacks that I just explained allow us to infer some bits of M2 based on side channel attacks. We also know C1 and CI-1, so we can learn the bits of MI, again, in a similar way to the paper. from 2009. So unfortunately, this attack fails because we don't actually know one. And one contains several salt and session ID. It's not clear whether these two values were intended to be secret in empty proto, but in effect, they are secret. So still, this attack highlights that the empty proto design is brittle. So as we discussed before, empty proto basically adopts a variant of the encrypted mark composition. Protecting the integrity of plain text rather than the ciphertext necessitates operating with the decryption key on untrusted data. This opens up the possibility of timing side channels. So we found 3 such side channels in the official clients, but empty proto also encourages the use of third-party clients. So there is a possibility that more developers got it wrong. It points at some ambiguity on whether working on new open source implementations of this protocol introduces more security to the ecosystem or rather risks adding new attack vectors. So all of these sort of biases could be entirely accepted by protecting the integrity of the ciphertext rather than the plain text. And so quickly, so studying the Telegram's key exchange was outside the scope of our work, but since we needed the several salt session ID values for the attack on the previous slide, we went ahead and broke the key exchange in order to obtain these values. So key exchange used textbook RSA encryption. It encrypted data that was concatenation of the actual data to be encrypted with a hash of this data and with some padding. And again, this caused really similar timing side channel attack as in the previous slide. And so we managed to recover the data by solving noisy linear equations via lattice reduction. We could use this data to recover several stall and session ID fields. We could theoretically use it for the man-in-the-middle attack against the encrypted exchange. Unfortunately, that's not feasible because the timing side channel is really small. Recovering session ID requires 2 to the power 4 computations, and key exchange would time out before the middle can be completed. The problem here was that Telegram's server code is not open source, and they do not want it open source. So we could not verify any of this ourselves. We had to rely on what Telegram told it would not work as an attack. Okay, so finally, let me conclude by saying that large parts of Telegram remain unstudied, like secret chats, key exchange, multi-user security, forward security, and so on. And so there is a lot of pressing topics for future work. I will conclude with that. Thank you, and you can find information at the link.
Thanks, Igor.
Okay, so I think we are way over time. Sorry, so this time we will not be taking questions. And I propose we move directly to the next speaker. Okay with you, Richard?
Yes, thank you. And finally, our last speaker will be Rune Fiedler, who I believe is in person. Don't see him at the podium now. Ah, there you are. Great. Rune, so Rune's going to talk to us about making Signal post-quantum secure. So Rune, please take it away.
Hi, everybody. Hi, my name is Rune Fiedler, and I'll talk about how to make Signal post-quantum secure. And we'll do this by using a post-quantum version of an asynchronous deniable key exchange protocol based on designated verifier signatures and CAMs. This is joint work with Jacqueline Brendel, Felix Günther, Christian Jansson, and Douglas Stabilar. So we're looking at the setting of instant messaging, where Alice wants to talk to Bob. You've probably seen this before. But what do we do if Bob is offline at the point in time when Alice wants to initiate the conversation? For this case, Bob needs to pre-upload his key material to a key server so Alice can fetch it whenever she wants to initiate the conversation. And this property we call asynchronicity. Another property that we want is mutual authentication, meaning that Alice should be sure that she's talking to Bob and vice versa. And the third property that we're looking for is offline deniability, or especially Signal is looking for this property. Intuitively, this means that if you have a protocol, a transcript of a protocol execution, then you can deny that you were involved in producing this transcript. But I'll get into more formal details on this later on. And with this message flow, this is actually split into two protocols. So the first one is the initial handshake protocol, extended triple Diffie-Hellman, or X3DH for short. And afterwards come the double ratchet protocol, which are used to keep getting new keys to encrypt your messages. And let's get into the details of the initial handshake protocol, X3DH. So in the beginning, Bob sends over his pre-key bundle, the key material from the previous slide, to Alice. And this pre-key material consists of Bob's public key. So Bob has three keys, a long-term key, medium-term key, and an ephemeral key, while Alice is only using her long-term key and ephemeral key. And then they're doing lots of Diffie-Hellman. So this is how they're pairing their Diffie-Hellman shares. Alice is using her own long-term key paired with Bob's medium-term key, and then Alice is pairing her ephemeral key with all of Bob's keys. And then Alice will send over both of her Diffie-Hellman shares to Bob, so Bob can recompute the same Diffie-Hellman secrets, and now they have a shared secret. The problem with this approach is it's relying on Diffie-Hellman, and as we all know, this is not post-quantum secure. And that is the starting point of this work. How do we replace this? Because quantum computers are a threat, so we don't know when they are coming, but if they're coming, we have a huge problem. Right. As we've seen, the initial handshake is vulnerable to quantum attackers. And then the other part, the double ratchet protocol, this can be replaced from key encapsulation mechanisms, as was shown by Alvin et al. In 2019. So the focus of this talk will be how to replace the initial handshake protocol. A natural candidate for this are key encapsulation mechanisms, because they are a primitive that is being standardized by NIST currently, so post-quantum secure versions. So this is what we are trying to use, and let's see if this works out. First, let's recap what key encapsulation mechanisms are. So Bob has a key pair consisting of a public and a private key, and he sends over his public key to Alice. Alice can then encapsulate against Bob's public key, resulting in a ciphertext and a key. Then Alice sends over the ciphertext to Bob, and Bob can decapsulate this ciphertext with the use of his secret key. Now both of them have the key, which they can use to which is their shared secret. This is what key encapsulation mechanisms are, right? So how can we build a post-quantum version of Signal using just key encapsulation mechanisms? A direct construction could look as follows. Bob has three chem key pairs, long-term, medium-term, and ephemeral again, and then Alice is encapsulating against each of Bob's keys. Then Alice can send over all of these three chem ciphertexts to Bob, who can then decapsulate them. The problem with this approach is that there is no Alice to Bob authentication. From Bob's perspective, anybody could have produced these encapsulations. So what can we do to get some Alice to Bob authentication? Maybe we can add a signature. The problem with a plain signature, though, is that it breaks deniability, because only Alice can create a signature that verifies under her public key. And as we've heard earlier, deniability is an important feature to Signal. So this approach doesn't work. However, let's keep this in mind. The idea of using key encapsulations to build a post-quantum version of the initial handshake protocol has been around for a bit, though. So there was the split-cam paper by Brendel et al. In 2020, who proposed to use a new primitive they called split-cams. And it turned out, though, that this is not instantiable with sufficient security parameters. But the design idea from the previous slide stuck around, so using key encapsulation mechanisms and not signatures, but some form of deniable authentication. And we propose to use designated verifier signatures for deniable authentication. Independently, Hashimoto et al. Came up with the same idea, and they've been using ring signatures for deniable authentication. So next, let's review what designated verifier signatures are. Alice wants to deniably authenticate a message M to Bob. So how does she do this? She's using the signing algorithm, which takes her own secret key and Bob's public key, as in Alice is designating this signature to Bob. And this produces an Alice to Bob signature. And the next algorithm, which is the difference to plain signatures, is the simulate algorithm, which allows Bob to simulate a signature. So this uses Alice's public key and Bob's secret key. And this also produces an Alice to Bob signature. And the cool property of DVS schemes is the source hiding property, which tells you that it is indistinguishable if this is a signature, an Alice to Bob signature that was produced by the sign algorithm or by the simulate algorithm. Spoiler, this is where we're getting our deniability from. Right, so what's the core idea of our protocol and of the protocol from Hashimoto et al.? Just the core idea, so I'm skipping the medium-term keys for a bit. We have long-term keys for both parties, which consists of a DVS key, and for the responder side, we're also using a CAM key. So the responder is using a CAM key actually for both long-term and ephemeral key. And then what does the initiator do? Alice encapsulates against both of Bob's CAM keys, resulting in two CAM ciphertexts. And next, we still need this deniable authentication, which was a problem earlier, and we use the DVS signature for this. So we have a designated verify signature designated from Alice to Bob, and the message we're signing are the two CAM ciphertexts. This is the core idea of our protocol. And let me briefly mention that Hashimoto et al. Follow the same approach. However, they're using ring signatures here instead of DVS. But it turns out that DVS signatures and ring signatures are equivalent for rings of two users under some constraints. Right. Now that we've looked at the protocol, what is this deniability property in more detail that I've been talking about? So this is an excerpt from the signal specification on the initial handshake protocol. And what they want is that there is no cryptographic proof that for okay, the laser pointer doesn't seem to be working. So there's no cryptographic proof that if you have a third party who has access to, who has compromised the private keys of all parties, and this third party, furthermore, has access to a conversation transcript, then it has to be the case that this transcript was produced by some party with legitimate private keys. Okay, this is a block of text. How do we parse this into a nice cryptographic definition? So first case, we have Alice, who has used the run algorithm to produce the message using her own secret key, resulting in a transcript and a session key. Second case, Bob has faked a transcript. So the fake algorithm is something that we've also included in our syntax. Here, Bob uses his own secret key to also come up with a transcript and a session key. And next we have this third party, the judge. And the judge cannot tell if the transcript and session key was produced via the run algorithm or via the fake algorithm. And that should be the case even if the judge has access to all of the secret keys. And this is the new deniability definition that we propose. So there's a prior deniability definition by Di Raimondo et al., but compared to their definition, our definition is weaker in the sense that it gives the fake algorithm access to the secret key of the responder. So they basically have public simulatability. On the other hand, our definition is stronger in the sense that our judge gets all of the secret keys. And we believe this to be a very important point to achieve deniability against nation-state adversaries, or rather nation-state judges. Because they may somehow find out your secret key by compromising your devices, by issuing a subpoena for you to give up your secret keys, or whatever else. And lastly, our definition has the advantage that you can build a proof with respect to our definition without needing any strong knowledge type assumptions. Right. And this is not all there is to our construction. The full construction is what we call signal in a post-quantum regime, or SPQR for short. And it includes the full scope of what needs to be covered by what needs to be covered by an initial handshake protocol to be usable in the real world. And that is, we also include medium-term keys to protect against the case that all of the ephemeral keys are used up. This is also the case for the currently used X3DH protocol. Also, we achieve security against randomness exposure by using a twisted PRF. And of course, we show security of our protocol with respect to a security model similar to the one from the original signal analysis by Cohn-Gordon et al. From 2017. And of course, we show deniability of our new protocol with regard to the newly proposed definition that I just talked about earlier. Okay, and there's, as you can see on the right-hand side, there's lots of details which you can all find in the paper. Right. Then there's more concurrent work because this is such a pressing issue. More people have looked at it. Lobson and Galbraith have proposed to lift the X3DH protocol to the setting of supersingular isogenies, and they've kept the same message flow as for the original X3DH protocol, but now we're over supersingular isogenies, and that's where we get the post-quantum security. So all in all, there's three different proposals for how we can get an initial handshake protocol that is post-quantum secure. Sorry, to be more precise, there's four. So the baseline that we can measure against would be the original or the X3DH protocol, which is currently in use, but is not post-quantum secure. And this was shown to be deniable with respect to public simulatability, so the definition from Di Raimondo et al. And it fulfills the full scope, so they have medium-term keys and security against randomness exposure. Then there's two protocols suggested by Hashimoto et al. Both of them are post-quantum secure, and they are using CAMs and ring signatures. And their second protocol that they suggest is using NISIX on top, and they need the NISIX to get the deniability with respect to public simulatability. However, their protocols do not fulfill the full scope. They do not include medium-term keys or maximum exposure security. Then next, there's our protocol, SPQR, which is based on CAMs and DVS and is post-quantum secure and shown to be deniable with respect to strong judges. Also, our protocol fulfills the full scope. And lastly, there's the supersingular isogeny X3DH protocol from Lobson Galbraith, which is also post-quantum secure and deniable with respect to public simulatability and fulfills the full scope. Let me also point out that the protocols by Hashimoto et al. As well as ours are generic constructions. So you can plug in a CAM and DVS or ring signature based on whichever hardness assumption you want, while X3DH and supersingular isogeny X3DH are fixed to one problem, which we assume to be hard. So to conclude, how do we get signal to be post-quantum? We have several suggestions for how to replace the initial handshake protocol. We can use the protocol from Hashimoto et al., our SPQR, or the suggestion from Dobson and Galbraith. And for the double-wretched protocol, we can use for example, the construction from key encapsulation mechanisms by Alvan et al. So one question, no, actually two questions for the audience, for the broader community, so to say. Which deniability notion do we want that the initial handshake protocol achieves? Do we need deniability with respect to strong judges? Do we want public simulatability? Do we want a stronger version of both of them? What type do we want? And also, how do we instantiate these protocols? So which hardness problems do we want to rely on? Or do we want to rely on always on isogenies? These are my questions for you, so to say. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for that. I believe we have someone in the audience for a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Did you have a look at the Signal group chats as well?
No.
All right. Easy enough question. Thank you again for the presentation, Rune. And with that, we are at the end of our session, and we are at the coffee break for those of you there in person. So